everybody, and welcome to Just Three Workplace Gurus, a podcast about the real world of work. I'm Vivian.
I'm Amy.
And I'm Mike.
Today we have an awesome guest. I'm so excited about this episode. We have with us Joe O'Connor. Thank you so much for joining us, who is the CEO and co-founder of Work Time Revolution. And you have, I learned of your work at the Future of Work conference that happened in June in New York City. And I was riveted, partly because I thought, oh, yes, this is what you put into words what I have been thinking for a very long time. And then you went even further. And so I think your ideas about work and productivity are absolutely revolutionary, on the money, literally, in many ways. And so I'm very, very excited to have this wonderful conversation about doing more in four. So Joe, I'd love to turn it over to you just to tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and maybe tell us a little bit of your journey, how you got here.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Vivian, and it's awesome to join you guys. As you said, I run an organization called Work Time Revolution that specializes in what we call innovative work models for the age of AI. I am from Ireland originally. I have been doing work in this space for about 7 years. I like to say that I was, talking about shorter work weeks before it was cool, pre-COVID. I did some research in Ireland, which I can talk to you a little bit about, which really inspired me to follow this path. And yeah, I found myself a little bit at the crest of a wave post-COVID. Was probably one of a few people globally that was actively doing work on this when the pandemic, the Great Resignation came along. Ended up leading a lot of major global pilot programs of a 4-day work week before moving to Toronto, which is where I'm now based, to set up this firm. So delighted to join you and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So question, we're always very interested, us here on the podcast, just what leads you here? So you said you've been doing this work for about 7 years. Curious to know what you were doing before and what made you have this aha moment to say, wait a second, I think people are doing it kind of backwards.
So my aha moment was I was leading some research within the public service in Ireland, looking at issues around productivity, well-being, work-life balance, work time. And one of the things that I discovered was that we had a lot of working parents, mostly women, who were already working, reduced hour schedules. This was extremely common for people coming back from maternity leave, and they were doing so for an equivalent reduction in salary. But what we discovered when we started, looking into this in a little bit more depth, having some interviews with their managers, with the employees themselves, looking at the data, was that in almost every case that we studied, their job expectations and responsibilities were largely unchanged. And the work that they were getting done in the condensed schedule was broadly in line with what they were doing prior to the change and broadly in line with their colleagues who was working full time. So that's when
Interesting.
I discovered this theory, Parkinson's law, that a task expands to fill the time that's available for its completion. Started looking into some of the early studies of a shorter work week in countries like Iceland and New Zealand. And then, as I said, this went from something that I guess I was super interested in philosophically to something that became much more practical when we had this wave of leaders and organizations who became much more open-minded to trying new things, experimenting, testing new ways of working. And that was really the oxygen that gave momentum to the 4-day work week global pilots that I was involved in for a number of years post-COVID.
Fascinating. Well, you just said something that really resonated. What is it? The task expands to fit the amount of time you have to do it. That is so true. I have this little cube. I don't have it here with me, but it's like a 5-minute, 15-minute, 30-minute timer, or even up to 60 minutes. And I got very interested in the Pomodoro technique just because it puts these like very tight parameters on the work focus period, with breaks in between 25, maybe 30 minutes, followed by a 5-minute break and then another 25, 30-minute period, et cetera. And maybe you do 2, 3 at the most, and then you take a big break. And I noticed that just putting that timer on, knowing that I had 25 minutes to do something was so different than when I have this sort of open time. And tasks that, I thought would take an hour took 5 minutes, which is amazing. So that concept is very interesting, but you're taking it to a macro level. What I just discovered was discussed was a micro level. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Mike and Amy? You too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that organizational science, and we use Pomodoro with our clients, it speaks to a number of different related issues. The idea of time blocking and focus, the idea of the need to punctuate your workday with micro breaks, and also this idea of, you know, creating, momentum around task completion by putting a specific amount of time against it. But I think that the bit with the 4-day work week, and I want to lead with this because, I spend my life kind of persuading people that this isn't some kind of a fantasy or, a magic solution. And often, we've got so much great data and case studies of organizations that have made this a success. And even still, I think a lot of leaders, to some extent, understandably disbelieve it because it feels incredibly counterintuitive. And I think that there is a really important psychological dimension to this, which is that, in many organizations, I would argue in most organizations today, the incentive structure is broken. Most high performers believe that the only reward that they receive for finding efficiencies in terms of the way they do their work, finding new innovations that enables them to produce more in less time, is that more task and more workload gets loaded onto their plate. And
Mm.
so part of the magic, if you want to call it that, of the 4-day work week is that it completely flips this incentive structure on its head. And so, yes, a big part of this is it enables recovery and sustainable performance. Yes, it creates this focus around attacking things like busy work and meeting bloat that we know exist in so
Meeting
much of
bloat.
modern work. But it's also fundamentally an initiative that seeks to resolve what is often the biggest obstacle in any productivity initiative, in any digital transformation, which is, do we have the requisite employee buy-in and engagement to make this a success? And the 4-day work week, because it shares the reward with the workforce in such a tangible, meaningful way, it really leverages that in incredible ways.
I think
Very
that's a
interesting.
really
And the
interesting.
reward is the
Sorry, go ahead, Vivi.
no, go ahead. I was just saying the reward is that you have a 4-day work week, not a 5-day work week. You have those 3 days off in a row, hopefully in a row, maybe not, but that's what you're calling the reward.
Right.
And okay, got it.
I think the use of the word reward is important because this works today. It may work, maybe in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, this will become the new normal. That's kind of a different landscape then. But to do this effectively today in an industry where most of your competitors are working 5 days, most of your clients are working 5 days, this requires a serious concerted effort. And so it can't be, this is more strategy than it is perk. This is an incentive, it is a
Right,
tool, it is not a kind of a concession or a giveaway.
right.
Joe, do you think
Mike, you were
there is
about to
a
say something. I
cultural element to this? And the reason I bring that up is we've talked on the podcast before about sort of the American view of work. And I think we particularly just seem to think that the more we work, the better we are as human beings, which is probably not working very well. And I remember having a conversation with some leaders at a company not long ago and saying, you hired me because of my expertise. I've been doing this for 20 some odd years. I can do the work potentially in a shorter period of time than someone who's been doing it for 5 years because of the experience. I can sort of shorten the time and just move through things. And so then the question is, do you want me to take on more, or do you want me to enjoy the fruits of those labors and have a little bit of a break and work a 35-hour week, or if you're in tech as I am, or maybe a 40-hour week instead of a 50-hour week. But I get the feeling, having worked internationally for a long time, we think very differently about work than our counterparts in Europe or Asia, South Asia, where I have a lot of friends and colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a cultural dimension. I think definitely the baseline mindset and the baseline structure in the US, this feels more radical than it might do in
Yes.
certain parts of Europe. No question. And I do think it frustrates me in that if you look at a lot of the debate right now about return to the office and a lot of the, I read an article in Axios last week about the return of the big boss CEO, this kind of more machoistic kind of culture of leadership. And I think, I'm not My issue here isn't with the policy. I think for a lot of organizations, more time in the office may well be the right solution. Hybrid might be the right solution. Remote first might be the right solution. My issue isn't with the policy. It's with the debate around it, where we're
Mm.
going back to this kind of proxy of commitment and availability, where there doesn't seem to me to be a huge amount of rigor in the data that justifies these decisions.
None.
And I do think, to your point, it is this kind of a mindset question. And one of the other things that I think is starting to pervade the workplace debate is this idea of, work-life balance is kind of old hat. Work-life balance is, that's, the new age thing is work-life blend or work-life integration. Well, my argument is that works for me because I'm an entrepreneur. I run my own business. I control my own time. I have a very direct share in the reward. I have the flexibility to kind of, to some extent, pick and choose my schedule and my workload. I think that is an incredibly silly thing to try to work towards for the workforce as a whole, because when you're aiming for this kind of blending, it amplifies the biggest problems we have in workplace at the moment, which are around, digital distraction, context switching, all the noise, all the chaos, all the clutter. My view is we need better boundaries, more focus at work, more detachment outside of work. And it feels like that there's this kind of counter narrative that's pushing in the other direction, that
Yeah.
everything should be this amorphous blend. And I'm just not sure that it's good for either people or for businesses.
Well, I
I
think you're
couldn't
right.
agree
It's very
more.
difficult to detach when you are working all the time. You may take a vacation, but if you take a phone call every morning while you're on vacation, are you really taking a vacation? Because then you have this residual
No.
time before or after the call when you're thinking about work, and that's not the goal of a vacation. Well, it's fine. It's just a call. It's easy. And I do it all the time. I admit that I'm a prime offender. Amy and Vivian and I have sort of established a pact that has gone off,
No,
where
we failed.
we were
I
going to
have
really
failed.
take
We're
weekends off. We were
failures.
really going to take vacation time. I don't think any of us has been that successful at it, but I think that's absolutely true. We get drawn into things and we don't realize how important that separation is.
And there's some really compelling data on this. A study
Mm.
just published this year, it was published in Harvard Business Review, showed that there's such a thing as the detachment paradox, whereby managers, if you ask them, do they think that it's good for performance if employees detach from work? And the answer is yes. Managers do believe that this is a
Mhm.
good thing. It makes better, more productive employees. The trouble is that when they're asked to put that into practice, when it comes to, you know, gauging the level of commitment of employees who detach versus those who don't, promotions, and who they see as being a more promotable employee, they skew towards the people who don't detach. And so that speaks to your point, Mike, that this is something that, that this isn't that managers are bad people or they're trying to intentionally sabotage their own company or their own employees. It's that there's a cultural hardwiring about this that we need to break open.
That's true. My company, Performance-Based Ergonomics, does ergonomics and wellness. We're consultants. And I remember going into, so we have a lot of high-tech profile companies that are in the forefront of all sorts of areas, largely in the tech sector, as well as biotech, right? Which is a little bit of a different creature because you have physical demands in the lab that require people to be present, but that's kind of another discussion. But anyway, I remember giving a presentation and talking about so before I did this I'm also a concert pianist. And when I was in conservatory, musicians in conservatory have been studied because we do these intense spurts of practice, which takes every part of your brain. And then we go sit in the lounge for a while and we look like we're a bunch of lazy people, hanging out, but we're really recovering. I didn't know that's what we were doing at the time, right? Then you go back in for another 45 minutes, blast your brains out and then you go like hang out. But that was so much more effective to learn a piece, to memorize a piece, to get it to a level than sitting in a practice room for 8 hours straight, which I've done also, right? Because it's a point of diminishing returns. So I was citing this, I was sort of giving this example and saying how, it sounds counterintuitive, but when you take breaks, you are actually more productive. And the look of horror on everybody's face really struck me. And it was really management at that time. Now, granted, this was about 10 years ago that I gave this, but it stuck with me because they were like, shh, like, what are you telling our people to do? And I'm thinking, wait a minute, all these companies have the ping pong table, and they've got the basketball. I mean, they set it up for people to use, but people aren't using it. Right.
Right.
So, to your point of this hardwiring, it's the employees themselves, but I think it's also the organizational structure. Because what I hear more than anything, and I even suffer it, and I run my own business too, so I theoretically have, more control over my time. But you called it meeting bloat. I call it like back-to-back madness. It's exhausting. And people are like, I'd love to stop, but I can't. There's a pressure from behind me that I got to keep up with everybody else, and the job is demanding it. So people are just resigned and they're like, okay. And what I hear more than anything is, I don't have time to do my work because I'm so busy in
Mhm.
meetings, which keep generating more work. And why do we have these hour-long meetings and, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on.
Right.
So anyhow, it's a big issue to tackle. So I'm very curious what you use to sort of present your argument, because you're talking about data and studies, and would love to hear about that.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, to your point, there was a study done by Desk Time which showed that the highest performers take about 17 minutes of break to every 52 minutes of work, which
Hmm.
speaks somewhat loosely to the kind of Pomodoro idea. You'll have heard me cite this study, Vivian, but when I always think of it when you mention things like ping pong tables, Oxford University last year looked at 90 different well-being interventions, corporate well-being programs within organizations, and they studied the before-after effects in terms of, these are things like yoga classes, meditation, sleep apps, and they found that only one was actually effective in having any kind of positive impact on employee well-being. That was enabling people to volunteer for charity as part of the work week.
Oh,
But,
Really? Wow.
interesting.
you know, point here to me is, and there's a whole other interesting conversation about why that particular intervention came out as being particularly effective. But the point here is, it doesn't mean that those other 89 aren't useful. It
Right.
doesn't mean that those other 89 aren't impactful for certain
Mm.
individuals and that they aren't in and of themselves, good things. The problem is that if they're layered on top of unsustainable workloads, unclear expectations, poor boundaries, leadership role modeling behaviors that kind of suggest detachment as a sign of poor commitment, then honestly, it is like, Nero fiddling while Rome burns. It just is it's kind of tick box tokenism that makes you feel like you're doing something to try and address the problem without actually tackling the
Yeah.
systemic structural issues underneath.
That's a good point. Amy, I'm curious to hear from you because Amy, we had a great podcast early on about productivity, and we all agreed that we all get that adrenaline kick when you cross things off the list. And Amy, that's like one of your particular things. Are you recoiling at this idea? Is it like, I'm just curious what your knee
I
jerk reaction?
am, but I'm excited for it too. And so I was going to ask the question of, just for clarity too, is your 4-day work week 10 hours in those 4 days? I mean, I think when you look at, for me and my role, hours are hours, right? It's a matter, I'm a commissioned salesperson. My income is reflective of how I work and what I do and what my activity is. Is it always, do I work the smartest or the most efficiently? Probably not. And to your point, I'm like, oh, I've got to get this done, but I've got 8 hours to get it done, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, when you look at an individual contributor at a company where you see that they are successful through this 4-day work week, because I'm here for it. I would love to have one more day to get things done at home.
So there's two models. You have a compressed work week, which is you're working your regular hours, but you're condensing them into 4 days. I think that can work as an individual policy for certain people as a flexibility option. I think it can work in more blue collar type environments where longer shifts are more common. For me in knowledge work, I'm not sure how effective that is. I think that there is a diminishing rate of return on productivity if you're looking at much longer days. That can actually have negative effects both for burnout and for people's performance. Are you really as productive in your ninth or 10th hour on a Wednesday as you are in your first or second hour on a Friday? So the programs that I've been mostly involved in, it is about a strategic reduction in working time for the same salary, but with the expectation to deliver the same or better performance. And I think, the reason why often this can be so successful is that I think lots of flexibility models that exist today are highly individualized. They're
Mm,
very discretionary. They're very based on, case by case exceptions or arrangements being made with your manager locally. And so in those situations, it's all up to the individual to kind of figure out a way to make it work. How can I get my work done within the parameters of this arrangement?
right,
The shorter work week, as I define it, is a collective initiative. And so it's not just about the individual finding ways to become more productive, using things like Pomodoros, creating greater focus within how they approach work. It forces teams to look at how we collaborate, how we communicate, how we make decisions. And so I think a lot of the productivity opportunity lives in those kind of collective processes. And so if you've got a structure that's designed, you know, at an individualized discretionary basis, you're probably not getting there. You're probably not getting into that opportunity.
right.
How do you change your leadership? It starts at the top, right? What have been some of the challenges that you've faced with getting that leadership on board to this process?
I definitely think it comes down to mindset. And I would say, caveat here that the types of leaders and organizations who approach people like me saying that this is something that we want to explore or experiment with, you know, we're probably talking about that kind of 10% that are more progressive, more innovative, more forward thinking. So I always caveat this with, my experience may not necessarily be reflective of the broader market, but I've had leaders who are so on board and bought into the concept, and the issue then can be with middle managers. And
Right.
if you think about it, if you're a middle manager, isn't it a very uncomfortable thing if your leadership says, you know what, I think we can get the same amount of work done in 20% less time? Sometimes managers interpret that as, that's kind of a pretty poor reflection of me. That's kind of a,
Interesting.
that's almost our leadership saying that we have all of this excess waste that exists within the organization. And so I do think there's lots of operational and logistical questions that need to be designed thoughtfully and worked through. But I think, that the biggest roadblock and the biggest barrier does come down to the fact that this does represent quite a shift in mindset for leaders.
But I appreciate the collective experience because I think, you're always going to have the individual who sort of over identifies with work. And for whatever reason, maybe it's workaholic, but there's other things behind it, which is like, I don't want to stop working because then, I'm going to start thinking about things, whatever. It's a good escape, right? Or their identity is so tied up in this working thing. And sometimes the case is legit. We're a startup. We've got a million things to do. There's that crazy adrenaline that's going and you're into it. And, you sort of don't pay attention to time at that point, but
Right.
that invariably leads to burnout.
And,
I've
and
seen
I
it.
think, it comes down to what's our starting point. Like people need to look at this not as a kind of a one size fits all,
Mm,
thing where it's blanket across the board for every firm. It is a strategic tool based on your context. So in a startup situation, we know the number one biggest reason why startups fail is founder burnout. And so if I'm a VC, I'm thinking about, I'm investing all of this money in a firm. If I want to protect my investment, my most important asset here is making sure that they aren't going to run themselves into the ground. And so in that situation, if you're working 60 hours a week, do I expect you to get to a 4-day 32-hour work week? No, absolutely not. In the case of the example of the workaholic who lives at the desk, to me success is that person on a Friday, they might still be working, but do
right.
they now have more space and more clarity that they can actually get through work? And it means that they're less likely to take work home with them in evenings and weekends than they otherwise were. So, I do think this is not something about being absolutist here. This is
Yeah.
about recognizing where are we starting from and where can we get to realistically.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I've heard you say things. I'd be curious with some of your, even the data, the metrics, there's concepts, there's philosophy, but to really, Amy, you said, what are the challenges? I'm a little more, and you also said, sorry, Joe, that people approach you. But there must be some skeptics in the house, right? What allows you to reach them, and what tools do you use to sort of, you know, present the case to say this is what's going to happen if you do this? What are the benefits to an organization? Let's put it that way, concrete ones that
Right.
they can say, oh, this is compelling. I want to take this more seriously.
Well, I think that there is some very compelling data on reduced attrition, much lower levels of turnover in the organizations that have done this successfully, very substantial and tangible savings on things like recruitment, retraining, upskilling as a result of that. We have seen very, very tangible reductions in things like sick leave and absenteeism, where when people both A, have more time for recovery, and B, are able to schedule out of work appointments during the standard work week, that tends to have a significant reduction effect on sick leave and absenteeism, which is a huge problem for so many firms. One other interesting one is that, this is something where there is a serious currency to time and flexibility today, particularly amongst younger generations of workers. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
while a shorter work week, in the way that we approach it, it's not about, reduced time for reduced salary up front, because it's a time for performance, not a time for money trade-off. Over time, it is true to say that if you're offering something like this, which is so differentiated and so unique in most industries when it comes to value prop, if the standard rate of inflation in salary in your industry is 4 or 5%, you can probably be super competitive at 2 or 3% if you're also doing this. So there's also a potential
interesting.
long run pay restraint saving
Yeah,
in terms of labor costs as a result of this. And that's before we even get into the conversation around performance. And so when we're talking to leaders, we always center this as a performance conversation. I think most people take the well-being and the burnout and the attraction and retention benefits as read. I don't get a huge amount of pushback on that. So we always focus on how this can work
mm,
as a performance
yeah,
initiative.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Amy and Mike and I have talked a lot about taking vacations, disengaging when you're on vacation, but even working the weekends. Because for a long, long, long time, I would use Saturday as that quiet day to write the blog post, to catch up on whatever, get organized for the week. And if there was some big project going, sometimes it's billed to a Sunday. By the time Monday rolled around, I was worthless. Absolutely worthless. Then I thought, okay, no more weekends. I'm going to take those back. And then I suffered a period of just anxiety of all the things I could be doing and should be doing and wasn't doing. But on Monday morning, I was very eager to do it and sort of came out the gate. And then I also started giving myself meeting free Mondays. And that was a huge game changer. Friday, I tried to have that also on Friday, but it's at least
Right.
a short day. But that syndrome is real.
Sure.
And so, that point of diminishing returns and trusting it and maybe just trying it. And then you start to say, wow, like I'm physically energized and clear headed instead of
And
just,
you can see how, all of those things that you described, how if you've got the leadership sign off and permission to do these things, and you've also got all of your colleagues within your direct team also, taking that initiative, it makes it so much easier to actually make progress and not get, because often with these very individual things, you start doing them for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, and then, expectations and work just takes over. And
This
so,
is a small little fragment of it, but we have these floating holidays now at our office where, you can take whatever of the holidays that are out there. It's your choice, right? Based off of your preference. It doesn't work because you're like, okay, I'll take this as a holiday, but then half the company might still be working. So and your industry might still be working. And so the things are still trickling in and people are like, how come you're not responding? Because if it's a holiday, you don't typically put an out of office
right,
there.
right.
So it's just that it's a very small part of what you're saying, but you have to have everybody on board for it to be truly successful.
Yeah.
I think it's very similar to why often universal PTO ends up being a lot better on paper than it is in practice.
People
Mm-hmm.
don't take it. Right. Or, yeah.
Or
Yeah,
they
I
take
think
advantage of it. One or the
scenario,
other.
Yes.
you get this scenario where, depending on who your manager is, it's a different kind of micro culture in terms of how they approach that. You end up where, again, there can be a very gendered dimension to who actually puts their hand up to take the greater amount of flexibility. And now you get this situation where people are guilted or othered rather than changing the norms of the team, which is really what this should be all about. But to your point earlier, Vivian, a huge part of this can be such a learning and a focusing exercise for the firm. One of my favorite stories was a company called Sensi Labs based here in Toronto. They did this initially as a kind of a talent play where they're a software and tech company. They're competing with Meta, Google for like product developers, engineers. They just can't compete on salary. And so this was a way for them to change the game. But their CEO, Jay Goldman, talks about how this initiative did two things. One, it created a huge amount of pressure in the system in terms of their processes and their systems. It actually, it wasn't that it solved everything, it surfaced the kind of inefficiencies that existed within their processes and systems. And then secondly, what he found was he did an exercise where he asked teams and individuals to think about how they thought their own performance or productivity should be measured. And the results from that exercise he discovered was that there was a real disconnection between people's understanding of measures and the things that are important in their day-to-day work and the way the company actually created value. And so what this initiative did was it created much greater connection and alignment between what people were doing day to day and the outcomes that the company was trying to achieve.
So interesting. I have a dentist, a great dentist, and she runs a very unique practice. And she told me that at one point she met with a consultant to talk about, like, part of the theme was, I may be misquoting, but how to protect herself and her team and how to get the most out of the team. And they have a same concept, but they realize it differently. It's something like every 6 or 8 weeks, the whole office shuts down for a week or two. So there's these, it's sort of like we'll work, but then like that's it. We absolutely disconnect. And they just posted something online saying, all right, everybody, from basically for 2 weeks to savor the last bits of summer, we're going to tip our toes in the sand, and we're not available. But the entire company does that. I think they just hire a service to take calls, and they have an online mechanism, like where do you go if you have an emergency kind of thing. So that's not quite the same thing, but it is. I mean, the whole idea is we're going to have these big chunks of absolute disconnection. That's the reward. And it's been working beautifully. And she said, actually, I feel like our income or our not just the productivity, but the revenue has actually gone up, which is very compelling.
Right. And, when we talk about absolute disconnection, I always use this example of, I think one thing that scares leaders about this is they think that what we're talking about is complete switch off outside of the new normal hours, which is just not practical in most firms. And so it's more about being very clear and very deliberate about what are the things that require employees to give flexibility back to the business. And so one example might be, if you're working a 4-day work week and you're on the golf course on a Friday and a critical client gives you a phone call, the expectation is A, you're taking that call before you get back to your round of golf, and B, that's not something that you're going to expect to get time in lieu for. So there is an expectation that this is a two-way street of flexibility. And so you need to define the situations and the scenarios where, yes, we do expect a degree of flexibility to be given.
Right.
I think that in that type of scenario, in a small team, if you've got a team of 5 people, having a rotating emergency cover system where actually once every few weeks, you can't go up the mountains for a hike where you're out of signal. You need to be the person that is available in the event of something happening. And so it isn't as, is about, just being clear about, yes, those things are permissible, but we're going to stop the unnecessary 10:30 at night, emails just because your manager happened to be thinking about something and they decided to contact the entire team. These two things are not the same.
That's very interesting. Right. So it's not, all or nothing. And I like your idea of a rotating person on call just for the, but in your experience, do you find that it's more successful for those who adopt this to say the whole company is off on the same day, or you can choose which day? Or is it a mixture?
It depends. I mean, if you're a marketing agency that, you're not doing crisis communications, right? So most of your value or the work that you're doing, You need to deliver X deliverable to Y client within Z timeframe to a certain standard. Then in that type of scenario, because most of their value is generated through internal collaboration and people working together to innovate and solve problems, you may well be better off with a universal day off because it maximizes people's availability to each other. If you're running a business that is very focused on responsiveness and availability to the customer, that's not going to work. And so that's when we're into a kind of a roster or split shift type of arrangement
Yeah.
to maintain service coverage. I mean, that is one of the biggest misconceptions about this, that this necessarily means a 4-day work week for the company. It does not. There are
Right.
companies who offer 4-day work weeks to their employees who are open not just 5 days, but 6 days or even 7 days.
That's true. It depends on the industry and what the needs are, et cetera. Because there are parts even in my company, there are some people who have the luxury of saying, "I don't care when you get your work done, as long as it's done by such and such date." Or if our response is, if our policy is within 48 hours or whatever it is, if you're doing it at 2 in the morning or 7 AM, I don't care if it works for you. But then there's others that, you're right, they're more client facing. They have to respond within the active work window. So I hear what you're saying. Interesting. So Amy, if your company went to 4 days a week, could you do it? I'm not picking on you, but I'm just curious because I'm asking myself the same thing. It's my dream. It's like where I'd like to get to.
And I'm not saving lives, so I should say yes, because I really, I think I would embrace it, and I think I would give it a try. Yes, I think it's a mindset that I would have to create. This goes back to just almost how you were raised and like your generational stuff. So even though your company might go down this path, it goes back to like I grew up in a house. If you're sick, no TV on. You're sick. You sleep or you go to school. So
You do something, right?
yeah, yeah. There's not like an in between. So for me, like I don't know. It would be a huge mindset for me psychologically. But I would
Well, it caught me earlier. You're like, I'd love that fifth day, that day off to do stuff around the house. And I
yeah.
think, Joe, I mean, yeah, it's personal choice what you do with your time off. But I have a feeling, Joe, part of your uh, philosophy is disconnect.
Right. I mean, we're having this podcast on, I work Friday mornings. A lot of our clients are in the UK. I can only service them in my morning, their afternoon. So
Yeah.
I work 4.5-day work week, but it probably looks like in terms of hours more like a standard 4-day week. I just take
Yeah.
that flexibility back at different times in the week. So it's an example of this is not a
It's not
thing.
black and
Can we touch on AI briefly
Yes,
before?
please. Yes, because that's a big piece of this.
Well, I just think it's important to make the point. A lot of our conversation has been about how organizations have done this up to now, right? Like I've worked with hundreds of companies to do this over the last number of years. So up to today, this conversation that we're having right now, and it's all been predicated on this idea of how can we do more in less time,
Hmm.
okay? Which has been possible for a great many firms, but I would also be the first person to say that there are companies today for whom that may not be possible and for whom this may not be the right fit as we're having this conversation today. AI is going to change the game in a lot of ways in this respect. And the reason for that is that in a lot of roles, human value is going to be less about how do we do more in less time, and it's going to be about how do we do fewer things better. Because digital labor is going to take over so many of the task speed and task volume components of today's productivity. And the things that are going to be critical from a human contribution perspective are going to be things like judgment, critical thinking, complex problem solving, creativity, connection. And I would argue that all of these facets and traits and skills, we know these things are much better leveraged through things like motivation, well-being, recovery. And so I think that is really going to open up a totally different dialogue in an awful lot of places. In other words, if you can scale a efficient process and a repeatable process infinitely using digital labor, why the hell would you care about making your employees 1 or 2% more efficient? What you're going to care about is how effective they are. And so I think when we think about productivity, often leaders use the terms productivity and efficiency interchangeably. They're not the same things. Efficiency is a product of speed and volume. And, we are not going to be able to race against the machine on speed and volume in the future. Our
Right.
focus is going to be elsewhere. And I think that that's when something like a shorter work week becomes even more compelling in that scenario.
Very interesting. You know, I have really in the last 6 months embraced leveraging AI as a tool to help my productivity, my efficiency, and so I'm falling into a new trap. So, you know, I still do my writing and whatnot, but it will start formatting things for me. And of course, you know, we all know that beauty of just, you know, typing in the thing you're looking for. I need to create a manual, blah, 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 blah. And then like, "Ugh." The thing that would have taken me 3 weeks is now taking me 3 days, right? Which is marvelous. So what I personally need to do is not say, great, now I'm going to get to these 10 new products and projects, excuse me, and just keep filling that time is rather than, okay, leveraging that efficiency so I can reclaim some of that time. So I think that's something that also has to be guarded against.
Absolutely. I mean, I think leaders that are purely looking at this as a kind of turbocharging exercise are kind of missing the point. What AI can do is provide much greater clarity on the things that are most important and most impactful in a world that has become very, very bloated and blurred. And
Chaotic.
I think that that's how we should be approaching the potential of AI.
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, it's not quite AI, but it's also this doohickey that I think is like ruining our lives, actually. And so even when we disconnect, first of all, I think it's making us less productive at work. So we will work longer hours because we're kind of flitting all over the place and taking these little Twitter breaks or
Vivian, for
whatever.
clarification, sorry to interrupt you, but your doohickey is your cell phone. So,
Yes.
because not
Our
everybody is
everybody is watching.
seeing you.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. If you're watching, you'll see me waving my phone around. And I think that that's part one, right? Like this morning, not to call anybody out, but somebody in my family, like literally grabbed their phone to come to the breakfast table. I was like, oh, wow. It's so like a part of us. I'm like, but, and to their credit, they didn't actually interact with it, but it was there, you know? So I think that's also a part of we're not turning our brains off because we go from one screen to another screen. So that I think that's somewhere in the mix of this conversation.
Absolutely.
So
And,
just
I think that this, my message would be to leaders who see there being, a bigger opportunity from AI than just cutting costs, an opportunity to actually unlock human potential. And so, thinking about things like there is so much fear and resistance, and lots of data that suggests there's a huge amount of resistance and fear amongst the workforce to AI. So something like time dividends, where you say, if we're able to create X amount of capacity using these tools, we will share Y back to you in the form of time back, is something that could be a really powerful way to accelerate, your AI strategies within your firm. Also, so much focus is on, people are very fearful about their what task that I'm currently doing could AI automate? And so there's an opportunity for leaders to kind of reframe that and say, instead of focusing only there, we're going to give you agency to actually reimagine and redesign and rebundle your future role. So actually, when AI removes certain constraints, where could your role within the organization go in the next 5 years? Actually giving people that agency rather than
nice.
having them almost as a passive bystander in this whole thing.
Oh my gosh, I'll be unemployed in 2 years. Right.
Right. I
Mhm.
mean, it's just not, if that's where people are coming from, they're not going to be excited about the potential of this technology. And if they're not excited about the potential of this technology, you can have all of the fancy strategies and, high powered, expensive tools in the world, probably not going to get very far.
Right. Very interesting. Mike, what are your thoughts? You've been a little bit quiet over there.
No, I'm fascinated by it. I think I did want to add to this part of the conversation that I do think we continue to add technology to our lives without modifying our behavior. So we just bring more tools in. I have so many friends who all of a sudden have long conversations with an AI tool every day. Like I know a couple who have coffee and talk to AI live in their kitchen every morning. That's just part of
Your
their
new
day.
therapist.
So we continue to add. I don't think, to Joe's point, that we subtract. I can remember the first
Well, yes,
time
you're
I
that's
ever
what we have
had
to
a
guard against.
tablet thinking, what am I going to do with this thing? Why do I have this thing? Well, now I'm sitting on the sofa and the TV's on, and I've got a tablet in one hand because I'm reading a book, and I've got my phone in the other hand because there might be an email I need to read. I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing? Like, I have to walk away from this stuff.
It's
So I think what we haven't learned, and this is probably the biggest learning coming our way, is how to step away from all these tools. Go out and sit in the backyard and enjoy. Well, it's going to be 100 degrees today here, but enjoy the weather. Like, be out of your. I walk every morning at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and the last week I have decided not to listen to. And I usually listen to a podcast on my walk. I'm not taking. I'm not listening. I'm just walking, and it's
you're
just
just
that need to
walking.
sort of disconnect a little bit. I don't tethered to
Love it.
something
Love it, love it.
24 hours a day, which is part of this work problem. We just keep wanting to work. We keep wanting to connect. We keep wanting to engage instead of disengaging, just hang out. I don't think we're good at that. I
Yeah,
haven't read a book
and giving
in
ourselves the
probably
grace to
10
do that.
years. Like, what's the matter with me? I was an English major in college.
That is so funny you say that, Mike. On the radio yesterday, they were talking about how book reading has completely declined. Not just that people are reading electronically or, hard copy or even listening to a book. It's completely declined. And it's because people have the option of reading a book or surfing, their social media accounts. And
Or listening. Yeah.
That's
I
that's a
do
whole
read
new
a
sound.
so
lot.
That's
I
sad.
just
another
Can
haven't
you
read
podcast.
a book.
imagine?
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen this, but Taylor Swift in the last week on Travis Kelce and Jason Kelsey's podcast talked about, in the context of online abuse, she
Mm,
talked about how energy, we should treat our energy like it's expensive. We should treat it like it's a
mm,
luxury item.
yes.
And I think that
Yes.
that
Wow.
insight is probably, it's more incisive than we're getting from much of our
Yeah,
business leadership right now. Because when we talk about things like, 996 shifts and kind of, if we want to be ahead in the software development game, we have to work 60 hours a week. If you are reckless with your people's energy, to me, that is just as dumb as being reckless with your company's money.
It's theft.
I couldn't amen.
And that's what those people are
Amen.
doing.
Wow.
That is so on point. And what I like to do, because we are coming on time here, Joe, I know that you co-authored a book that's going to be coming out next January, which is around the corner. So very excited to read it, called More in Four. Can you just leave us with a few sort of sound bites on that one so we know what to look forward to when it comes out? And
Sure.
yeah,
Absolutely. Do more in 4. Why it's time for a shorter work week. Coming out in January, the 13th of January next year with Harvard Business Review Press. I co-authored it
fantastic.
with a friend of mine, future of work reporter called Jared Linzen, who's written for Fast Company, Time, a number of great publications, and had also interviewed me many times on this subject before we decided to come together and collaborate on a book. And this will, number one, talk about why now is the right time for
Mm,
this conversation in the context of AI, changing preferences in terms of work, the climate crisis, all of the background reasons why this particular solution is a timely one. It has some deep dive case studies of all kinds of different organizations all over the world that have successfully done this, from Unilever in New Zealand to a architecture firm in St. Louis and all over the place. And then we kind of leave with some tips for employees who want to advocate for this in their workplace, B, leaders who want to explore or implement this in their workplace, and just also some practical tools and tips for people, even if you can't, work a shorter work week today, how you can kind of take these learnings and lessons that we've brought from all of these organizations that have managed to do more and less to just make your workday and your work week smarter, healthier, and a little bit more effective.
Great. Great stuff.
can't wait. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been very thought-provoking, and I hope if you're tuning in, either watching or listening, you get a lot out of this, and this sparks some new thoughts about this. And thank you so much.
Joe, thank you so much. Great
Thank you,
visiting
Joe.
with you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.